righty. Well, thanks for being here. Trying to get to the right slide here. I don't see my notes. Well, I'll make it up as I go along. Thanks for being here. I'm Sam. I've been with Check for about 3.5 years, and I realized that this is the last presentation. So to help lay the background for who we are at Check and why something like Temporal would matter for us, I wanted to kind of start at the beginning. Check pioneered and is leading the industry in embedded payroll. We have a powerful API for running payroll calculations, filing taxes, and most importantly, paying employees. And our partners are using this platform to seamlessly run their own payroll businesses. And we've done that now for 70 payroll businesses across a diverse range of industries. In 2024 alone, we processed over $4 billion in funds. You can see a sampling of these partners on the right up here. And to describe how close to home this is for me, I was actually on a walk the other day in my neighborhood and walked into a local coffee shop and requested a text receipt from their point of sale system. And I got the text receipt and I saw the Dripos domain on the text. And I looked at the barista and I said, I help run your payroll. And he got to excitedly tell me that they really enjoyed working with Dripos. And it's just really cool to see the end result of the work that I do each day. And as we've built this platform out, something that I've come to realize is that everything about what we do is a workflow. And we need to be able to handle workflows that take seconds or up to months, workflows that require human approval and intervention or waiting periods, complex branching periods. We need visibility and analytics, and of course, fault tolerance and the ability to work with flaky third-party integrations. And this really isn't new to our business. It's just something that we've come to explicitly identify. And until last year, we were handling this largely with Celery, crons, and other ad hoc state management. And none of these were perfectly suited to our needs. We really needed a better primitive. And think about one simple example out of many, the actual payroll workflow, where someone approves a payroll, and sometime later, we debit an employer for the funds of the payroll. Days after that, we pay employees. Even days after that, we file taxes. Along the way, things could break. We need to take corrective action. We're monitoring for fraud. All of these sort of things happening over duration of days. And really, again, up to this point, this requires complex async job orchestration, and developers really sort of just kind of have to know how everything's wired together. And it's not ideal. So for us, enter Temporal. At this point, we knew we had a need, and we were aware of Temporal. And Vivek, our CTO, basically said to me, I've heard of this thing called Temporal. I don't really know if it does what we need it to do, but it's probably worth checking out. We definitely weren't sure yet that Temporal was the answer. And so what I want to do is kind of walk you through the process that we went to investigate and understand if it was really what would solve this problem for us. One of the immediate questions that I was asking myself is does Temporal even work in a monolith? Check started as, and has remained intentionally so, a monolith. And again, Vivek actually recently published a blog post about our intentionality here. But especially a year ago, I think at the time a lot of the marketing materials that I was consuming referenced Temporal in microservices. And it wasn't quite translating for me, and it felt a little disconnected from the needs that I was able to articulate at the time. So I was honestly a little bit skeptical, mostly because I didn't have a great mental model yet for why Temporal mattered. Which leads me to my second question. Do we even need durable execution? What is it? It was a new term to me, and I was wondering if, ultimately, are we paying for something that we don't need? I had a little trouble digesting what impact this would have on us as a business. And lastly, do we need a new primitive, or can we just make our existing tools better? I honestly had some bias at this point. I was pretty heavily invested in the tools that we already had, and I felt like they worked pretty well. And I knew some areas that we could improve them, but I was relatively pleased with them. But nonetheless, I kind of forced myself to call out that bias and do a little bit of digging more closely to see what all the hype was about. I still didn't fully appreciate what I was doing, but with more investigation, I started to catch the vision and thought it was worth prototyping and testing out. So to see if this was the right tool for us, I took a very incremental and investigative approach. I first decided to prove out that it would even feasibly work for us by adopting it in our code base and basic structure. This was excitedly easier than I initially expected. I got like a locally running proof of concept in just a few hours and ported over some of our internal admin tooling to some sample workflows. In retrospect, it was still maybe just a little bit harder because I didn't have the right mental model yet, I think, for where Temporal fit into our framework, but ultimately got there. After that, I got a minimally viable production setup working with one host, no auto-scaling, nothing fancy, and we built out a real Temporal workflow using the vanilla Python SDKs. Again, very low investment, but enough to prove to ourselves and stakeholders that it would work for us. The goal at this point was really to showcase to our internal users what was at stake here. And also, part of this was answering for myself and others that question that I raised a second ago of why not just add more retries to something like Celery. This is where my appreciation for durable execution as a distinct concept from basic async jobs really started to solidify and sold me. It was going to take a lot for us to get to durable execution with our current tools. Given that, as I said, everything is a workflow, as we identified at the start, this was going to be a critical part of what we were doing going forward. At this point, I was pretty convinced that Temporal was right for us. We could see the impact of durable execution, and we knew for sure that the developer experience was going to be better than comparable tools attempting to solve the same problem. From here, though, we didn't exactly open the floodgates necessarily internally within the org. We started developing more production workflows in tandem with iterating on what we wanted the experience to look like for developers as we started to scale this out. So the next thing I want to do is start to look at some of those examples of the foundations that we laid for developers within Check. Once we were convinced that we were all in, we wanted to provide some tools for getting developers up and running quickly and easily. We first built Temporal into our local development Docker experience so that an engineer could get it up and running with the existing commands that they were used to using. We also created a little bit of our own thin wrapper around the workflow definition so that we could orchestrate some of our internal magic and tooling around execution and do a little bit to even maybe slightly more simplify the number of places that a developer had to touch to get a workflow going. We also try to keep the developer experience the DevOps experience pretty lightweight. So we actually support developers adding new queues in Python right next to the workflow definitions themselves. And in writing our initial workflows, it became clear that we could remove some boilerplate around unit testing. We also adopted the Sentry interceptor that's available in the Python examples. And that gave us a good opportunity to kind of internalize what role interceptors played in the workflow execution process. We did some more things related to wiring up Datadog tracing, getting the internal open telemetry metrics sent out to Datadog as well. And lastly, we spent quite a bit of time thinking about how we wanted to handle versioning, which I'll get into more in our examples. We set up some internal documentation that helps engineers at Check understand a little bit about Temporal and how Temporal plays into their context as developers at Check. But I do want to note in all of this, our goal was not to obscure Temporal to our developers. We tell them that we still want them to understand the principles and primitives that Temporal is offering them, but we just want to kind of contextualize that and explain some of what we're doing for them along the way. So let's jump into some specific examples of kind of that previous slide of what I was talking about. So this would be like a vanilla Python example of creating a workflow using the Temporal SDK. And honestly, this is great. It works well, and this is where we started. Another thing that I want to call out is that in addition to that workflow, you're probably going somewhere and just declaring or like associating this workflow and activities with a task queue and worker. And then on this slide here, you can see where we landed with our internal workflow definition. In terms of immediate complexity, this reads very similarly to the Python SDK. We just extend a workflow class instead of using a decorator. We make an assumption about your run method unless you override the naming conventions. We give you the ability to assign this workflow to a task queue in the same file here. And kind of behind the scenes and maybe a little less obviously, we're setting up a few more defaults for folks, maybe providing a slightly better IDE experience with class-based autocomplete, though quickly being eclipsed by cursor and AI. And we're doing some like tracing and metric creation along the way. The last thing that I want to highlight about this that's kind of difficult to articulate if you're not more familiar with the Python SDK is there's a couple ways that Python handles concurrency with threading and processes. And the Temporal SDK does a good job of providing a cohesive experience between the two for the developer. And I really didn't want to lose that, but there are some things that I couldn't accomplish that I wanted to using SDKs or using interceptors and process execution. So a little bit of what we're doing that's really just not obvious here is accommodating some of our own use cases while still supporting those two execution methods. And I honestly debated whether or not we even wanted to support that, and I will say, in retrospect, I'm glad we kept the optionality open. Next up, we'll go through a few other examples of things that I wanted to highlight. Here's a look at a basic unit test. Honestly, it's actually probably more of an integration test. We're running the full workflow, but we're just reducing a notable amount of boilerplating. Developers don't have to understand how to set up the test worker. We're providing some fixtures for common actions like executing and starting workflows. And lastly, we're making sure that this is running in a Django transactional test case so that database actions that happen as part of the test can be asserted upon in the test itself. Let's hop over now to our worker setup that I highlighted a second ago. This is something that I was pretty excited about and think developers have responded really well to. To set up new workers, we adopted an infrastructure as code strategy where developers can actually define their workers in Python code. This is very low barriers to entry for developers that haven't fully immersed themselves in our infrastructure as code and Terraform stack. And this also lets us have those queue worker definitions side by side with the workers themselves, that kind of like one file touched idea that I was highlighting earlier. Basically, the Terraform, or the deployment process creates a JSON manifest from the Python classes while it's running, and then Terraform just reads from that and gets everything set up correctly for folks. And this also lets you set a few like container level specs like memory and CPU in conjunction with temporal settings that I think make sense to have side by side with one another, like the executor type or target memory limits, max activities, etc. And then similar to our workers, I wanted an infrastructure as code concept for schedules as well, and those aren't, last I checked, those weren't supported in the Terraform modules yet. And back to the earlier concept, I wanted to go for this idea of having this all side by side with the workflow definitions themselves. So you've got your schedules, your actual workflow definition, and the task queue that is running on all defined right there. And similar to the previous slide, all that's really happening behind the scenes here is during deployment, we're getting all the schedules that are defined for the environments, diffing that with the schedules that are declared, and doing updates, deletes as necessary. And one important thing that we don't do is when we update, we don't adjust the pause state so that you can go into the UI and pause an execution, and that won't get overwritten on the next deployment. Last thing I wanted to share on the infrastructure side is how we handle worker shutdown and auto-scaling. We have a workflow to control scaling our workers. How very temporal of us. This takes advantage of the task queue metrics that were announced at Replay 2024. And all we really do conceptually, it's a little more complicated than this, but all we really do conceptually is we get metrics about the work assigned to our queues and make scaling decisions based on those metrics. And this also allows us to support scaling algorithms per task queue if we need to. And another consideration that I really wanted to accommodate was workflows and activities that might be running longer and potentially interrupted by deploys. we deploy tens of times a day. And while you could just let those be canceled and restarted, that Temporal is great at that, it was proving a little bit frustrating for developers who might have workflows with activities that were running on the order of hours, potentially, and to have those restarted and potentially restarted multiple times over multiple deploys. It was frustrating for them to have the total time elapsed on those workflows to be longer than they would expect. It's also important to note that ECS's managed deployments only allow you at most 2 minutes before they forcibly shut down workers during deploys. So what this allows us to do is essentially tell ECS not to shut down our workers, and then we will handle managing and shutting those down once activities have finished, and giving up to the graceful shutdown timeout period that Temporal already allows you to declare. It's really our own mini version of an ECS deployment controller. And I think it actually will serve as a nice sort of place for us to then invest in interacting with the versioning stuff that got talked about a little bit earlier. In our last example, and as I've alluded to a few times, versioning was definitely something on our radar. It was an area where I really wanted to be fancy, and honestly spent quite a bit of time heading towards something that looked very similar to what was described earlier, though when I put this talk together, I didn't know that that was going to be a part of the conference. And this is a point where I realized that simpler and slightly manual may be better. And that's where we ended up in this specific area. And like I said earlier, there's really a spectrum of options available to you. I've been to talks where folks have done a ton more than we've done, and folks that have done less than we've done. And it really needs to be tailored, I think, to your engineering organization and the particular needs that you have. One final thing that I want to note, too, about all of these things that I've described is we did not do these before starting to write workflows. We really, from our initial POC that I described through kind of like basic internal adoption, was really only a few weeks. And then I had a list of things that I thought I wanted to provide our developers that would give them just some slightly lower barriers to entry and some quicker development cycles. And we built those out as we built out more workflows. And since then, it's just been growing usage, ongoing refinement, and extra features as needed. Like, for example, the deployment controller that I showed previously. We didn't have that for the first 6 months or so of our adoption. So these are some of the key things we've done to adopt and scale our usage of Temporal internally over the last 6 months or so. Another thing that I also didn't mention earlier is we just did some internal trainings. I think I came back from Replay 2024. There was a little bit of excitement in the org about what we were getting into. We just did a simple 1 or 2 hour training with folks where we built a workflow together. And I think that had some really positive feedback. And at this point, we've got over 20 distinct workflows running in prod today, authored largely by unique individuals across all of our engineering teams. And if you caught the previous talk, we've had incidents where we got to watch our work or our activities fail due to third-party flakiness and then watch those recover automatically, which is just super exciting to see. We've got some workflows with wait conditions and human intervention, which is, I think, maybe an interesting talk all in of itself. And with all that behind us, here is some things on our radar for the coming months. I would say our current usage of Temporal is exciting. I'm really thrilled with where we're at. But it doesn't ultimately get us to that end stage of everything being a workflow and really capitalizing on the primitive of durable execution. Before we migrate some of our most critical business processes over to Temporal, here are some things that I'll share that I think we still have left to do before we are able to fully achieve that ambitious goal. Developers should know how to confidently modify workflows without risking breaking already running workflows. Like I said a second ago, this is something that we've held off on until now, something that I'm excited to, I think it looks like on the time horizon of this year, get a little bit better at. But even in spite of that, I think we could still do a better job of replay testing in our CI/CD pipelines, for example. But ultimately, this actually hasn't proven to be a huge deal for us along the way. Next, I think we should be able to more accurately observe and respond to issues as they arise. I don't feel like that we've totally nailed our monitoring strategy just yet. When monitoring workflows, it's not always easy to tell if the problem that you're seeing is an intermittent issue that will resolve itself or a problem that needs a code fix from a developer. I don't think we've found yet the right threshold between investigate everything and just wait and see what happens. We also have a number of human-in-the-loop processes that could, in theory, wait forever or quite a long time. And so we need to, I think, get better at monitoring and distinguishing between hard failures and something like SLA breaches, where the workflow may still be running and executing properly, but we've not accomplished what we wanted to as a business because we've breached some sort of SLA. These could be baked into workflows as timeouts, but again, the variability of how long those want to take, or how long those might take and what we want to support is hard to nail down on a concrete time frame all the time. I also think that we want to just get more reps at building successful workflows at bigger and bigger scale. Someone else highlighted this earlier, but the reality is every time we build a workflow, we learn something new. I think it was literally just last week that we added our first workflow with continue as new, because it was the first time that we bumped into the event history limits. And so we're taking an iterative approach, learning new things along the way, but it also kind of keeps us humble. There are plenty of things that we still don't know or are not perfect at. And at maybe a slightly more intentional pace, we also, I think, need to do a little bit more to migrate some existing Celery jobs and other ad hoc tasks. I'd like for us to take a little more advantage of durability on the scheduling front as well. We continue to move our old ad hoc cron jobs over to scheduled events. And actually, most excitingly, I want to highlight too the reality that I also look forward to removing some of our crons altogether. Because the reality is we have crons today, I call them like sweep-style crons, where we've got things in a certain state that have been sitting there, that the only way we have today to move them to the next state, because it's time-driven, not user interaction-driven, is we run a cron, we look for things in a certain state, and we move them over. And this is in the absence of a primitive to do otherwise. So we, with Temporal, actually now could have a longer running workflow that's managing that and remove the need for a cron job altogether. Whereas previously we didn't have a great way of doing that. And so to wrap up on a slightly more conceptual level, I also just want to continue to grow our internal understanding of durable development. Adoption is growing. Most engineers have now authored their own workflows. And there's a temptation for new engineers, myself included when I was learning all of this, to think of it as just a drop-in replacement for Celery. But we really want to think bigger than that. Like a code smell here is a workflow with one activity that does a bunch of stuff, right? And ultimately, as we talked about up front, we're trying to build out this modular monolith design. And building in the right service boundaries and patterns is key to our success as a business. So we look forward to continuing to pursue this principle of everything as a workflow in our modular monolith architecture, using Temporal as a key primitive for orchestrating those business-critical workflows. And I think that's it.
If you have questions, please raise your hand. I'll bring the mic to you.
Thanks for the talk, Sam. You made a statement about everything is a workflow. I'm curious if you personally or your organization kind of qualifies that at like some type of granularity. I know there's been like discussion on community Slack about like, hey, why don't we just model every HTTP call that we do as a workflow?
Totally. Yeah, everything as a workflow, I think, is a guiding principle for our business, but it is not ultimately the goal. I would say maybe every process that we have, we want to model as a workflow. I don't anticipate in this moment that we'll move HTTP processing. We do still have a REST API that we handle with more traditional back-end mechanisms, yeah.
Okay, other questions?
How do you do DR in your solution? Are you relying on the temporal cloud or on internal solutions somehow?
Yeah, so we do use Temporal Cloud. And after I think it was the Datadog talk yesterday, saw the stuff that they had gone through, I looked at Vivek and I said, we made the right decision there. So a big proponent of Temporal Cloud, and at our volume, it's still not cost prohibitive to us yet. And so yeah, we're counting on all of the hard work that they've done, which is, I mean, way more than we have capacity or expertise for right now.
Other questions?
Thanks for the talk.
Yeah.
Obviously, in the payroll business, strong consistency is very much required. You can't bill people twice or pay people too much, too little. Did Temporal help you solve that specific problem within the payroll space? Your talk so far focused more on the developer enablement aspect rather than in specific industry.
Right. Yeah, that's very fair. So idempotency is key, and I think we've had some discussions, and I think there's a little bit of even apprehension sometimes about an activity retrying in perpetuity, right? Because if you mess up that idempotency, you can send an email 100 times before you even blink, and that can be problematic. So I think maybe the short answer is we're still working on it and trying to do that well. And I think some of that also gets into what I was highlighting, just with wanting to grow as an organization in our sort of like durable development style, like thinking about these problems, thinking about what sorts of things we really want to be sure we don't do twice. We have to do it once. We don't want to do it twice. It is only once. And so I do think it will help us, but I don't know that we've nailed that in all regards yet either. Yeah.
Okay, well, that takes us to the end. Let's give a round of applause to Sam for a great presentation.